Hello everybody, this is a special video and it is a orchid diary of sorts, more or less describing the influences that shaped and molded and oftentimes initiated this obsession, this hobby of orchid growing. Now, I am taking you back to the good old days, probably before many of you were even thinking about orchids, but this is back in the day when nurseries would put out these color catalogs and would send them to you upon request. And this is an example of some from Hoosier Orchids, which is what I'm talking about today, which I will also get into more in depth. Carter and Holmes used to do that. And lo and behold, here's one from Hauserman from 2003, 2004. And again, it was full of color pictures, very glossy. Carter and Holmes, the same way, lots of information. Today, though, I am focusing on Hoosier Orchids, which you can see the date is 2001. This was shortly after I moved back to Illinois from the PNW, the Pacific Northwest, Seattle specifically. And believe it or not, as a disclaimer, I did not know about any Seattle orchids until I moved back. Shocker. Same as I did not know about Hauserman before I moved back. Well, you know what? I did, but only after I had moved away from Chicago did I know about Hauserman, which is ironic. But in any event, when I moved back from Seattle with a handful of orchids that I had collected while out there, I stumbled upon Hoosier Orchid shortly after, because it was about the millennium, right before the millennium, 2000, and shortly after that, I discovered Hoosier Orchid. Now, Hoosier Orchid is very dear to me, besides the fact that I am a Hoosier. Now, if you don't know what a Hoosier is, here's a little lesson about the Hoosier, and it is Hoosier. So the term came from the Bicentennial History by Howard H. Peckham, and he describes, one version is, contractor named Samuel Hoosier was building a canal around the falls of rapids of the Ohio. He preferred to hire most of his workers from the North Bank or the Indiana side of the river, and they became known as Hoosier's men, or simply Hoosiers. Now, at first, it was an uncomplimentary word, shouted in derision, as were Quaker and Shaker. And soon after, they called themselves Hoosiers, proudly and even defiantly. Now, having given a definition of Hoosier, the way that I understand Hoosier to still mean in the minds of many is a hick. Country, that's basically it. Almost on the verge of being a redneck. Closed-minded, hick. That's what I would say is a Hoosier. So, and I am a Hoosier, although I am not a hick. But anyway, that is the stereotype, the inclination when you call someone a Hoosier. Now, back to the topic. So I stumbled upon Hoosier Orchids around that time, and besides the fact that they were within driving distance, Indianapolis is about 80 miles from Danville, which is 30 miles from here. So Danville is my hometown where I grew up, if you didn't know. So it was easy to get to Hoosier Orchids, and I frequented that place a lot. The first time that I visited there, I was very, very shocked and surprised just at the variety of plants they had. They had 3 or 4 greenhouses. One was cold, and then the other were intermediate, and then they had a couple hot houses, I want to say, but there were a lot of things packed in those greenhouses, most of them seedlings, but at that time they had just recently, or they had gotten at some time prior to that, a batch of Fred Hillerman's seedlings, or his, maybe they were his mother plants, because they were hybridizing at Hoosier Orchids, but they acquired some of Fred Hillerman's collection of Angricoids and were doing their own crosses. And still today, hardly any person or individual does any of these crosses on a consistent basis. You know, a lot of the crosses that are out there have been done years ago, and are very in short supply around in cultivation. You hardly ever see a lot of those old clones around. You did 20 years ago, but they aren't around so much anymore. Peter T. Lynn is really the only one that I know that is doing hybridization. Now, I know there are some others, but he's really the only one that I can think of off the top of my head that is actively doing it. So, and Hoosier Orchids were doing it. And so that was really my first introduction through Hoosier Orchids, through Leon Glichtenstein, who was their hybridizer and their grower there, and who I always dealt with there. He was always on site. He was always the one who showed me around, who taught me the culture and introduced me to all of these varieties of orchids that I had never seen or heard of before. He got me hooked on Angricoids. He got me hooked on Gongoras and Stanhopias. He got me to looking at miniatures. I never looked at a miniature before I went to Hoosier Orchids. Now, this is completely a relic of the past. Hoosier Orchids is closed. These guides no longer exist. I don't know if any orchid nursery puts out a catalog that they send to their customers, because the business has just struggled recently, and that's another story. But the thing about Hoosier Orchids was that you can see most of their stock are seedlings, small. And at the time when I was just becoming introduced to these plants, I was not fully educated as to what these symbols actually mean in comparison to what it takes for these plants to be blooming size. I mean, just by these first few pages, you can just see the variety of the plants and the species and the genus and the hybrids. And just the names that you cannot see these days if you tried and looked. A lot of these orchids and plants, a lot of them you can find, but back in that day, 2000, this was a revelation to me. It went beyond the Bibles, as I say. It went beyond anything before, because in addition to pictures, I also got a little bit of information about culture, and so therefore it piqued my interest even more and made me even more curious and want to try more and more things, which in a way it was a good thing, but in a way it was a bad thing. Because of that inexperience, I spent a lot of money. These seedlings are not cheap. And I lost a lot of these precious plants. I know I had a Trichopilia Charlotte, and it was tiny. And I didn't know what I was doing. But I was guided by Leon, who helped me out a lot and influenced me and gave me confidence, even though I was failing miserably. He really made me aware of just the variety and guided me to where I am today, even though when Hoosier Orchids closed so many years ago, you know, my contact with Leon, well, I shouldn't say that, it really stopped. But anyway, I owe Hoosier Orchids and Leon, which I believe that could be his cross, And I think that is his cross as well, which is Gongor pterodactyl, which I had for years before it died on me. It was just the most beautiful thing, so fragrant of cinnamon. And like I said, when it's gone, and it is gone, and I don't think there will ever be another pterodactyl unless the cross is done again. But it was an amazing, amazing, amazing plant to have, and I owe that to Hoosier Orchids. Unfortunately, I lost a lot of Erangus and Gracums, but in doing that, it only made me more hungry because I never lost my interest in that pristine white, pure, fragrant flower that somehow just stuck with me more so than anything else in the orchid world, to be honest. It's those Angraecum star-shaped flowers and the fragrance. But these catalogs were just so much of an influencer for me that I don't know if I would have the same collection had it not been for Hoosier Orchids. So I will always have a spot for Hoosier Orchids, even though they are no more, and even though I don't have a single plant left from them. Those memories and those lessons and all of the just community that you gained from being there just molded me and have stuck with me all these years. So I owe a lot to Hoosier Orchids. Another thing that really stuck with me was, if you did not notice, these are artwork. These are someone's artwork that they commission every year to do for their annual catalog. And really, that is where I got the idea from Hoosier Orchids, from where I want to paint every plant in my collection as it blooms. And, take a photo and then do a painting, and then that's my goal. And then also do the pressed. But then I got that from Hoosier Orchids. So I don't have to say anything else as far as their influence over me. So I hope that this has been helpful, and this has been a Orchid Diary, a confession of inspiration. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your orchids. Bye.